afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland, this week's Full Scottish. My name is Isla Barker. Joining me in the studio today is Hugh Marshall and Paul McLennan. Nice to meet you too.
Hello.
Hi, Isla.
Hello. So on the programme, so Hugh Marshall is the founder of Talking Wales and Paul McLennan is a member of the SNP. So with the Ukraine update, the Ukrainian and US negotiators have been trying to secure a peace settlement of Russia's invasion, opened their last round of talks in Florida on Saturday, with more discussions planned through the weekend. Russian representatives did not attend the meeting. Russian and Ukrainian negotiators met at two sets of US broker talks in the United Arab Emirates this year and a round in Geneva last month. Moscow and Kyiv agreed on prisoner exchanges, but no breakthroughs were achieved. The White House described the latest meeting as constructive, with discussions focused on narrowing and resolving remaining items to move closer to a comprehensive peace agreement. Russian attacks killed 4 people in southeastern Ukraine and left much of the northern region of Chernihiv without power on Saturday. Zaporizhzhia Governor Ivan Fedorov said the morning attack on the city killed a man and a woman and injured 6 others, including 2 children. In the adjacent Dnipropetrovsk region, officials said 2 people died in an area southeast of the main regional center, Dnipro. In his nightly video address, President Volodymyr Zelensky said power had been cut to parts of the Chernihiv region, where efforts were underway to fix damages after a drone strike on an energy facility. Power and water supplies have also been cut out to parts of Kyiv. Authorities in nearly a dozen Russian regions in recent weeks cited various excuses to prevent demonstrations against internet censorship and the blocking of the popular messaging app Telegram. In most cases, they succeeded. Fearful of the crackdown on dissent since the invasion of Ukraine, activists decided not to risk holding unauthorized rallies. Tens of thousands of Czechs filled a Letny Square in Prague to rally against the government of the billionaire Prime Minister Andrej Babiš on Saturday, slamming it for arrogance of power. The Million Movements for Democracy movement organizing the protest has criticized the government for playing down threats from Russia invading Ukraine. Protesters, some carrying Ukrainian flags, criticized its refusal to provide military aid to Ukraine. Babiš leads a 3-party nationalist cabinet comprising his catch-all ANO party, the far-right SPD, and the right-wing Eurosceptic motorists. He is doing everything to drag us towards Russia and, together with Hungary and Slovakia, to dent the EU, Marek Perutka, a conservationist carrying a Ukrainian flag, told reporters. And so with the Ukrainian conflict passing its 4th year, how do you think these talks are going to impact anything? Do you think they will have any impacts? Any of you? Yes.
It's difficult to know and understand, because obviously, we're going to be discussing what's happening in the Middle East in a moment, but the whole way that sort of conflicts across the world are being hampered negotiations-wise by the United States is off the scale. We know that Russia are assisting Iran with their intelligence. We know that Iran have been supplying Russia with drones. So from a Ukrainian perspective, it's difficult to understand how exactly they can handle the situation. The fact now that Volodymyr Zelensky contacted the United States and other countries, offering assistance with how to take down drones, that was ignored by the United States, and now obviously people are listening to them. One thing I read this week that is quite interesting, it does sound as though Ukraine are rapidly increasing their own capacity and reducing their reliance on the United States for weaponry. And I think the sooner Ukraine and Europe can do this, the better, because the United States is now a threat to all of our national security.
Mm-hmm, of course. And now moving on to our Middle East update. As death and destruction... Oh yes, Paul, do you have any input?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Iran situation is feeding into what's happening in Russia. We see the US easing sanctions on Russian oil, which again is just feeding the Russian war machine, if you like. So again, it's kind of indicative, I think, of President Trump's yo-yo position. I mean, he changes positions on Ukraine, he changes positions on Iran, he changes positions on foreign policy all the time. But it's just easing. I think it's easing the situation for Russia when they're easing the sanctions on Russian oil. Again, probably caused because he's incursion into Iran. So, but again, the whole thing is just dictated by President Trump in terms of where he goes, and his policy positions change from day to day. And it doesn't help anybody in terms of this. But it's making the Ukrainian situation much more serious in terms of prolonging the war and obviously financing the Russian war machine, if you like.
Of course, yes. And the longer that these conflicts go on, the more expensive it is going to be, not only for these economies, but for the price of oil and energy prices, which can create a knock-on effect of inflation and such. So yes. Now, moving on to the Middle East update. As death and destruction expands across the Middle East and the focus of the world media moves to Iran, questions are growing about what the goals of the US and Israel attacks are, and if they are diverging as Israel intensifies its attacks on Lebanon. While attacks on Palestinians by settlers in the West Bank are growing in number and ferocity, Israeli forces have been accused of failing to intervene to prevent the violence. Also this week, a UN report found systematic Israeli torture of Palestinians indicates collective revenge and destructive intent. So, Paul, what do you think that the intensification or, well, inconsistency of the conflict in Iran is going to impact, say, the coverage of Palestine or any other factors impacting the violence there in the West Bank?
Yeah, there's no doubt that has an impact. Everybody's focus is on Iran at the moment, and again, you've probably seen Trump and Netanyahu change their positions from the start of the war. I mean, at the start of the war, it was about, according to Trump and Netanyahu, there was an imminent threat from Iran in terms of nuclear threat, and now that's gone back when they heard the national security advisor come back and say that's not the case. I think that for Netanyahu, it's all about trying to weaken Iran as much as possible. And he's obviously used that as an excuse to go into Lebanon and do the same thing in Lebanon, whilst they continue to the Holocaust, the genocide in Palestine and in Gaza. So there are many outcomes that both Trump and Netanyahu are wanting out of this, but they keep on changing their position, particularly Trump in terms of what this is about. He talked about regime change and Kenny said he was happy to help with people in Iran overthrow the government. That's clearly not the case. And Trump is desperately trying to find a way to get out of this. He's now asked the American government for another $200 billion in terms of this. And it's a crazy situation. He's struggling to get a way out of this. And already talking around about, how does he start to wind down an operation whilst he's starting talking about putting troops on Carg Island, for example. So again, it's indicative of the changing nature of President Trump's foreign policy along with everything else.
He does appear to be quite inconsistent. For example, he was saying that he needs help from the United Kingdom and other countries to help unblock the Strait of Hormuz, and then he U-turns and says that he does not need help at all. And then he U-turns again to say that he does actually need assistance once more. So it is quite clear that he does not really know what he's doing. Hugh, what do you have to say about this?
Yeah, he's a pathological liar, and I think he's managed to be able to lie his way through numerous issues with the United States public. But when it comes to a war, his lying receives far greater exposure because obviously, 3 weeks ago, we're winning the war, we've won the war is over. He's now talking about, sort of winding down, and then at the same time saying that, they're going to bomb, all of Iran's energy facilities. So, it's clear he doesn't know what he's doing. He has people, like Pete Hegseth as the Secretary for War, because obviously they went from defence to war. And it's quite incredible as well that people like Tony Blair are still part of this nonsensical board of peace that Trump has going. I've got friends in Jordan, and I was on a course last week in University of Lancashire with a colleague who was joining us online from Jordan, and was telling us, if you hear any bangs in the background, literally, there were, sort of rockets and bombs flying over Jordan, because Jordan's got a border with Israel, and Iran is on the opposite side. So it's a serious situation. And remember, places like Jordan, almost half the population, I think, are Palestinian refugees. So there's history of this going back, for decades and decades of Palestinians having to flee and making new lives for themselves in other places. But yeah, I think one of the key things with this war is that it was Netanyahu's war. Trump obviously didn't either listen or take notice of the implications of what would happen, thinking that it would all be over in a day or two, and it hasn't. And it's hopefully now it's seriously harming Trump's credibility, not just on a global stage, but also within the United States.
Yes, and even if the United States stops attacking Iran, then who is to say that Israel is going to stop as well? Do you think that this conflict could lead to another impeachment of Donald Trump, or potentially a vote of no confidence or anything like that? Paul?
I think he's obviously very worried about that. I mean, he's talked about the midterms, and he's already directly mentioned that about being impeached. So he obviously has that as a consideration. But the ironic thing is, the more he does this, the more he's turning people against him, the more people are likely to vote against him, hopefully in the midterms. In terms that, the actual rules for impeachment are quite strict. But I certainly think there'll be a push within Democrats for that. But the more Donald Trump is continuing to dig a deeper hole in Iran and other policy areas, the more likely I think he'll lose quite heavily in the midterm. So obviously that's something that's really worrying him just now. He's actually specifically mentioned that himself.
Mm-hmm. And of course, he has been hosting other summits with leaders such as the Prime Minister of Japan, where he made that Pearl Harbor joke. Do you think he's going to try to pull any other countries into this conflict here? Oh, yeah, Hugh?
Yeah, from my point, he obviously is trying to do so. I think there's a situation here where it's quite bizarre, really, that he's caused this situation, by basically bombing Iran. Obviously, the Strait of Hormuz is a major passageway for trade, not just oil, but just general sort of trade and container ships. But he seems to think that that doesn't affect the USA, so it's our problem, in Europe and the Middle East, and he just miscalculated it, completely. But I think this is the thing now. I think hopefully this will be the thing that drives people. And in fairness to Keir Starmer, he may be not very good at domestic politics, but on the global stage, he does perform better. And I think he's acted in the right way. Although unfortunately, they have given permission now, I think, for US bombers to use British bases in order to bomb sites that are attacking the Strait of Hormuz. But it's almost like he's sort of Trump has soiled his own bed, and now he's expecting somebody else to clean up the mess.
I think Keir Starmer's background in law has helped with his negotiations and analysis of this conflict. He's been quite withdrawn from escalating, I think, except for this recent development. Oh, yes. Something hitting London. What? Oh yes, missiles hitting London. What? Right. I'm hearing something about a dodgy dossier about missiles hitting London.
I think when you go back through history, the military sort of action has been taken based on dodgy evidence. So we've had claims that Iran had were within days or weeks of creating a nuclear bomb. This despite Trump telling us all that all their nuclear capabilities have been destroyed about 6 months ago in their last incursion. And it just goes to show that that if you're using information selectively, then it can be quite dangerous. I think there was an example. I think it was yesterday that 2 missiles were fired towards one of the bases, Diego Garcia, and although they didn't quite reach there, it showed that their inter sort of continental ballistic program was far more advanced than was expected. So there are real threats and dangers here, and the fact that Russia are helping them with intelligence is deeply disturbing. The fact that in order to try and keep prices of oil down, that they're using sanctions on Russia, who are actively part of the problem, both in Ukraine and in Iran, is absolutely incredible.
And speaking of increased oil prices, as the impact of the wars in the Middle East affect energy markets and the global economy, the economic impact is now being felt at a local level, with inflation leading to increases in the price of energy, food, manufactured goods, and an increase in lending and mortgage rates. What should be done to ease the growing cost of living crisis? So how does the cost of oil impact mortgage rates, Paul?
I think there's a number of things. I think obviously the price of energy would push up inflation. And inflation, the Bank of England has a target rate of around about 2%. The financial markets are already pricing in increased interest rates, whereas they were forecasting earlier on probably 2 or 3 decreases. So they are forecast to rise. So that's obviously going to push up the cost of borrowing, push up the cost of mortgages, push up the cost of food. So oil prices, I think I've seen this morning, were predicted possibly to reach $170 in terms of this. It also pushes up gas prices in terms of this. And this is obviously where energy costs are set in the UK in terms of that. So it's going to put a lot of additional pressures on people who are already struggling at the moment. And again, it's very indicative of where President Trump's thinking kind of goes in this, because he's driven very much by the financial markets and the impact it's going to have in terms of him. So it's a worrying time. Inflation will go up, interest rates will go up, food costs will go up, and I think it's one of the key things is how long will this conflict go on for. If it continues to go on for a number of weeks and months, it's going to have a longer term impact, as I said, on inflation, on cost of living, cost of borrowing, and so on. That obviously impacts in business as well. So there's medium to long term implications of this as well if this conflict doesn't resolve itself very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so I've just got here that there are reports that Keir Starmer is going to shut Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland out of an emergency energy bill summit. Hugh, what do you think the reasoning behind this could be, of shutting out 3/4 of the United Kingdom out of this summit?
I think it's just par for the course for his actions. There was leaked information last week or the week before saying that Starmer was ordering, sort of officials in London to ignore the devolved governments. When you consider that in Wales, the devolved government is actually a Labour government, it makes it even more astonishing. But this is par for the course for Starmer and Labour, and before them the Conservative Party. They don't treat devolution with any kind of seriousness or respect, and for them it's a hindrance rather than what it should be, something that benefits the people of Scotland.
Mm-hmm. And so the SNP has called for Keir Starmer to convene an emergency four-nation summit, and it is confirmed that UK energy bills are expected to increase by an additional £332 from July. So, Paul, there was a promised reduction in energy bills from April. I believe there was going to be a price cap reduction. How likely or realistic does that seem now?
I think the energy cap will be set in for April. It's set before. But I think the key thing, Keir Starmer came in, Labour promised to cut energy bills by £300. It since then. Obviously, the reduction in April would reduce that, but it's still around about £450 more than Keir Starmer had promised. And if you're talking about another £332 in July, you'd be talking about fuel prices being £700 or £800 more than Keir Starmer promised just 2 years ago. In terms of, I think there's a number of measures that Keir Starmer could take. Heating oil obviously is quite a high level of cost for people who are in more rural areas, and that will impact both Scotland and in Wales. The Scottish Government have put more to a fund than the UK Government have, and I think that's something that's really important, because people have seen prices double in terms of this. But I think there's a few other things that Keir Starmer could do. For example, the Scottish Government's been pushing on a bit of social tariff for energy prices for about those who are highly impacted by fuel poverty, and I think there's a number of issues as well. We've got our energy prices that are worked out by gas prices, and we've seen a huge rise in gas prices. Scotland produces more electricity than it actually needs, yet our energy prices are based on gas. That needs to be changed as soon as possible as well. So there's things that Keir Starmer could do very quickly, but he needs to involve the Government of Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland in terms of this. And it's ironic when we produce so much energy but have no powers over regulation, for example, to reduce the costs. And that's one of the biggest costs that people are facing in this cost of living crisis just now.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Denmark produces so much surplus energy. They often get energy for free, sometimes for 6 hours a day, because of their production of renewable energy. So then, Hugh, you said that Wales has a Labour government as well. Do you think there is any way that at this time the government in Wales could sort of push back against the Labour government in Westminster?
I think they're trying to as well. They're trying to distance themselves from the Labour government at Westminster because it's clearly having a detrimental impact on their chances at the upcoming Senate election. But as you say, that pushback is just too little, too late. And whatever happens now, it's just damaging Labour's credibility in Wales even further. And I think one of the issues is, maybe Paul can explain a bit more about this. Wales is limited in its powers from a fiscal point of view as to what they can actually do to mitigate things involving cost of living crisis. I think Scotland has some more levers, but Wales aren't in a position to actually do anything practical that can help people.
Mm-hmm. So, Paul, how could you explain this discrepancy in power in Wales and between Wales and Westminster?
Well, again, I think this is the way that the Parliament's been set up, and we've got to remember both Parliaments are still devolved Parliaments, and both Parliaments could have powers removed by the UK government at any time, and that's why we need to push for both countries for full independence. But that's why we see the powers controlled by UK government, whether it's Labour or Tories. Nothing changes in terms of this. As I said, we don't have any powers in Scotland or in Wales over energy regulation and how prices are set, and we could be changing that right now in terms of this. And I think that's why you see Labour struggling in the polls in Scotland and heading for absolute disaster in Wales as well, because they are not standing up for the interests of people in Scotland or in Wales. And they would rather kowtow to a Labour government who, quite honestly, don't even respect the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. And we've seen that just a few weeks ago with a leaked memo from Keir Starmer, which was obviously highlighted the problem in Wales and Scotland. So in Wales, hopefully we'll return a plaid government and push for more powers and ultimately independence from the UK, as does Scotland. But we could be facing the situation we have a nationalist government in Scotland, nationalist government in Wales, and a nationalist government in Northern Ireland. where Keir Starmer will have to sit up and listen to the devolved administrations.
And so with this leaked memo that's been mentioned, from what I've seen, there hasn't been much information about it. There hasn't been like a statement from Keir Starmer that I have seen, or like an attempted apology or anything. Do you think he's just trying to sweep this under the carpet, hoping no one notices, or could there be another reason there hasn't been much from Westminster about this leak?
I think from a Scottish Government point of view, and you probably talk from what's going on in the Senate, it wasn't mentioned. It was mentioned by John Swinney on a number of occasions. Keir Starmer obviously didn't deny it, didn't push back on it. And Anna Sarwar, quite frankly, has said nothing on the issue whatsoever. And the memo obviously was trying to say to people that, that it doesn't matter. I mean, it's Labour Party interests first and the interest of Scotland and Wales thereafter. In terms of that. So again, it's indicative of how respectful Keir Starmer and how respectful Labour Party more generally in Scotland and Wales is of devolution. But you'd be able to say a little bit more on what that's looked upon in Wales.
And so with the increase of energy prices, it is also going to impact manufactured goods and anything quite labour intensive. So it could it potentially... Oh yes, labour intensive. So could it potentially impact, say, Scotland's strongest industries such as salmon, whiskey, or while it is not manufactured, tourism could probably be affected as well from transport costs, and in Wales as well, Hugh. Hugh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah, yeah, I think it's going to have an impact on travel costs.
Hugh, we still can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me? You should be able to hear me now.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so obviously it's going to have an impact on individuals' travel costs, but it's also going to have a severe impact on the cost of transporting goods. And obviously, many of the things you've mentioned, from a Scottish point of view, Scottish salmon. And whiskey, it's a huge export market. So, the fact that the cost of transporting that, but also the fact with the Strait of Hormuz now is making it difficult to move things around the world, it's going to have a huge impact on, on everybody and everything. So this is where, the standing up to Trump and just saying enough is enough has to be done, sort of as soon as possible, because it's an issue so serious. It just goes beyond the fact that whatever Trump's reasons that he wants to sort of deflect, attention from things like the Epstein files and multiple other things. Remember, Netanyahu is facing an election this year, I believe, and he's also facing criminal charges. So, both have vested interests to have conflict in order to either postpone or delay, because, there's talk about the midterms, about, using the War Act to stop the midterms being conducted, and this is what dictators do.
Mm-hmm. And so, for example, a few months ago, Trump was saying how important Greenland was and how it was essential, and now it seems to have just been forgotten as a distraction from the Epstein files, as you said, and then going to war in Iran, and then with Netanyahu trying to delay the inevitable election that will probably see him removed from office. Yes, it does look like they are trying to scramble for whatever methods they can find to stay in power for as long as they can and distract people from trying to hold them accountable, put them in their place and such. So yes, this is a really uncertain time for the whole world, really, and I'd like to thank everyone for their input. So moving on to the Afghan Resettlement Scheme. So this week, a National Audit Office report warned of failings in the UK government Afghan resettlement schemes. The report comes 5 years after the US and UK withdrew from Afghanistan, leaving the Taliban to retake control. So it says here that 37,950 people arrived in the UK under Afghan resettlement schemes between April 2021 and December 2025. And they offered resettlement to certain groups of Afghan citizens citizens, including who worked in the UK government in some capacity during its military presence in Afghanistan. So people have been saying that this scheme is a bit too little, too late. Hugh, how do you think the government has sort of failed in this resettlement scheme for Afghan citizens?
It's just off the scale. The fact that so many Afghans, who were eligible to be relocated to the United Kingdom for their work with the British Army in Afghanistan is incredible. We're talking about people who've been waiting for over 4 years for support. They're not getting it through the official channels that they're supposed to through the Welsh Government, and much of the work is actually being done by British soldiers and former British soldiers who are working sort of tirelessly to try and get these people who are their friends and people who put their lives at risk in order to protect their lives to safety in the UK. It's shocking. Who knows how many people who should have been given rights to travel to the UK to resettle have been killed and died. We don't know, but it's a stain on this government.
And so I understand that foreign policy and defence is a reserved power in the United Kingdom. But do you think the SNP could have any power to support Afghan citizens or refugees, or would it all have to be down to Westminster? Paul?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. I'll come and touch on that point in a second, because it does have an impact on what happens in Scotland. But I think when you look at the situation in Afghanistan, we have seen UK and US going towards, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq, and what's happening now in Iran, with flimsy reasons for doing so, and no exit strategy whatsoever. It's never thought through, and we've seen that all the way through. In terms of that, we've seen the servicemen who've come back from Afghanistan who don't get the care that they require, and often are left in trauma for a long period of time. And I think the armed forces themselves have picked up on that. And I think when you're seeing people who have come across from Afghanistan, we can all remember the planes fleeing Kabul when people literally were running after the planes who were promised to be looked after, and people obviously died over in Afghanistan in terms of that. So it's been chaotic, to say the least. I think there's been around about £25 billion that's been spent in Afghanistan due to the war over a number of years, over 20 years. So again, that's horrific in terms of that, with no success out of that whatsoever. We can understand why after 9/11, but there was no exit strategy in terms of it. Does impact in Scotland, because obviously Scottish Government has taken in Afghanistan refugees in terms of this, and there is an additional cost in Scottish Government and on local authorities, but they've taken them on and taken it on very, very admirably in terms of that. And at the moment, obviously we're seeing with asylum, we have people coming up to Scotland, and these are settled by and dictated by the UK government. We have no powers over that, when people come from who are seeking asylum status, where people are pushed. And when I was House Minister, I remember local authorities being told literally days that they were going to get X number of thousands of people that were arriving. So there was no planning, no funding followed suit in terms of this. And again, it was indicative of UK government having no respect whatsoever for the Scottish Parliament, no respect for Scottish local authorities, and no respect for the people who quite rightly were looking for the right to settle in the UK.
And so it's saying here that this is going to cost billions of pounds. What are they going to be spending this on exactly? How is it going to cost this much, do you think?
Well, I think the cost is estimated at 6 billion, because obviously it's an ongoing cost. So you're talking about just the costs of the legal costs of looking into whether these people are able to come here, the costs of transporting them and their families, and obviously then the living costs of these people sort of moving forward. And as you can imagine, with any sort of government initiative, sort of the legal costs are going to be a big part of it. This is the other thing. This is the other cost of war that people don't appreciate. So after every conflict, there is an ongoing cost in some shape or form. And we can see, we're likely to see similar things coming from Iran. Once this conflict hopefully comes to an end soon.
And so, in Wales, are there any efforts in local authorities to settle any Afghan citizens, or is it mostly in England or Scotland and such?
We have in Wales had Afghan families being relocated. We currently have some Afghan families in a hotel in South Wales, which is sadly being boycotted by the usual racist idiots, thinking that they're small boat refugees. So yeah, it's something that's happening in Wales, and those families get support from Welsh government to help them resettle and integrate into their new communities in Wales.
Mm-hmm. And so, Paul, how do you think that Westminster could more adequately equip Scottish local authorities for housing refugees or providing education? Or supporting any Afghan citizens who are still stuck in the country?
I think there's a number of things, and this comes back to the situation, I think, in terms of working with the government, the Scottish Government and UK Government. As I said, when I was House Minister, you've seen situations where those who had been granted a right to stay were literally told within a short period of time they would be coming up to Scotland. There was no discussion with Scottish Government or with local authorities. They were often just told a number of days beforehand they could be getting literally hundreds of people, and a hotel would be commissioned for that. So first of all, there needs to be that level of respect from the UK Government to discuss this with Scottish Government and local authorities. There needs to be funding that follows that, because the pressures then came on Scottish Government and other local authorities in terms of this. So there needs to be that broader level of respect in terms of that. And there needs to be planning, not just in terms of 1 or 2 days or a couple of days in advance. They will know what's happening, what they should be forecasting in terms of this, and how they handle the situation of Afghanistan. It's not been handled. That the local authorities to try and make sure that people are rehoused in our communities and welcomed in our communities, and I think that's the most important point. And Hugh's talked around about it, about the agenda of some people who, quite frankly, at the moment have racist agendas, who don't want to wish people welcome people from war-torn parts of the world who've gone through the process and had that right to stay and been judged by the UK Government to have that right to stay. I think that's we should be trying to change that narrative as well. So, and Scottish Government has always said that it welcomes people into Scotland that have gone through that process, and I'm proud of that, and I'm proud we've done that both in East Lothian and in other parts of Scotland as well.
And so I have here that Lord Haddon Cave might find evidence of any extrajudicial killings in Afghanistan, which would mean that the UK Army had committed war crimes. Do you think the government is really going to focus on this during this settlement scheme, or sort of sweep it under the rug?
For me, I think that's a tough one without actually knowing the details of the case. But they should be open and transparent. Anything that goes on in terms of this, whether that was in Iraq or Afghanistan or other parts of the world, the military aren't above the law when it comes to that. And of course, there will be rules of engagement that we'll know all about, but they can't be above the law in terms of. So the government, the UK Government, should be open and transparent about that, about anything that comes forward. If there's anything that is found in this, they need to be open and transparent and communicate that to people in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And so moving on to keeping the promise. So the Children Care Experience and Service Planning Scotland Bill was passed in a final Stage 3 vote in the Scottish Parliament this week. The bill guarantees lifelong entitlement to advocacy services for all care experienced people. So in the past, the bill extends aftercare support for currently unavailable to 16 to 26-year-olds who were in care on their 16th birthday to those who had left care at that point. And this focuses on accommodation, education, employment and well-being. So this promise to help with care experienced individuals, how is this going to be more implemented, especially with the upcoming Holyrood elections? The Parliament is sort of starting to slow down and is deferring certain bills, such as the ban of the Guga hunt in the Isle of Lewis, to the next Parliament. How can we assure that this is going to carry on into the next election?
I think I'd look. My background at Isla was in local authorities. I was a councillor for 15 years and a previous council leader. So Scottish Government has passed the legislation, and I was proud to be part of the Parliament, member of Parliament who voted for that as well. So they passed the legislation in terms of this. So it will be indicative on Scottish Government and local authorities to kind of push this forward, and other agencies such as social, and obviously advocacy services and care providers as well, to kind of move this on. So I think that's one of the key things, is how we implement the bill. That doesn't mean that all the things that were in the promise before have been delivered, and there was almost a recognition that we need another piece of legislation that we need to come forward in the next Parliament. So I think it's indicative on the next Parliament to pick this up as well, to look at that. But it's a major step forward in terms of what we're trying to deliver. One of the most humbling things I had in the Parliament in the last 4 or 5 years was in terms of meeting 43 cared for children who told us, learned about what it was like to be in care and what they needed to live a better outcome, to live a better life and have better outcomes, whether that's through in housing, whether that's in education, whether that's through the justice system, and so on. That was incredibly humbling. So it's due to all parliamentarians now to try and take this forward in the next Parliament, but there is more to be delivered, and probably in another bill in the next Parliament as well.
Great. And so, Hugh, with the elections coming up in Wales as well, are there any particularly prominent promises from parties such as Labour or Greens and such to improve care in Wales, or are they just going to go on their current policies?
Yeah, well, as I said, not all the manifestos have been published yet, but there has been, significant work in that area by the current Labour Welsh government, that's been supported by other parties in the Senedd. It was interesting that those in care who are leaving care, becoming adults, were the subject of a guaranteed wage for a period of time to support them, and the outcomes of that guaranteed income were very positive. Although interestingly, the far right tried to paint it as a way of small people on small boat crossings coming over being able to access funding, which says a lot about the right and the far right. But I think it is an important subject, and it is something that that we sometimes don't think about. And I think one of the big issues, obviously, is with care as well, is that it's become a business as opposed to a service that ensures that children and young people are given the life and the circumstances that allows them to thrive as individuals until they become adults.
Mm-hmm. And so, Paul, with care experience young people moving forward from this bill, how do you think it is going to really benefit them? I've seen that fewer children in Scotland have been growing up in care since 2020, which is a reduction of 18.1%. What do you think has caused this reduction?
I think there's learning from policy in terms of that, about obviously moving children from care into, if it's a fostering setup, a long-term adoption setup. I think that's important. But I think one of the key things, if you look at life chances for people who are in over the number of years, it impacts on their ability to achieve qualifications, be that vocational or through school. It also impacts on their job opportunities in terms of that as well. So there are clear signals that children in care have suffered over a period of time, whether it's in their health, whether it's in their education, whether it's in their job chances, whether it's in the justice system as well, whether that's looking for housing. So I think there needs to be clearer pathways in terms of people who leave care or are in care. There needs to be people who advocate for them quite strongly in terms of this, so they're getting that independent advocacy. as well. And quite often when people leave care, and you touched on it earlier on, Isla, is aftercare. Some people might leave care, for example, at 14, 15 or 16 or whatever, but still require that support for a number of years. And I think that's important that support is there for them all the way through. So I think the bill that's gone through takes that forward. There are still many things to do in terms of this. And I think it reaches a wider agenda in terms of how we look after children, but also in terms of child poverty, for example. And the Scottish Government has a really strong lead in terms of that, for example, through the child payment. But we need to make sure that children have as equally as good a start, if not better, than anybody else going through the same age at that particular point. This is a good step forward, but there's more needing to be done in the next Parliament for it as well.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think could be done in the next Parliament then?
I think it's making sure, for example, and we're talking about the pathways for housing, because one is implementing the bill. There's one thing having the bill there. The second thing is how you implement it and how we follow that. So I think it's making sure there are clear pathways in housing, there are clear pathways for people through the education system in terms of that as well. And again, I think there's a role for not just the Parliament, there's a role, for example, at the Scottish Parliament to make sure that these policies are being implemented, they are being followed through, and to make sure that, because this is not just going to be delivered by Scottish Government, it will be delivered by local authorities, it will be delivered by care providers themselves, it will include schools, it will include housing providers. So I think what the work for the next Parliament is include this bill is implemented as soon as possible, and one to say that we get the outcomes that we're going to get through the bill, and I'm confident we will do, but we need to make sure that these are delivered, and I think that's the role of the next Parliament.
Mm-hmm. And so are there any other policies that you think, not just necessarily care related, but in terms of education or health, that could sort of be combined to aid any care experienced individuals, for example, in Wales, Hugh?
Yeah, I think Paul makes a very important point. It's local authorities who organise and arrange a lot of this provision. And there's clearly a huge issue with the funding that is available to local authorities and their priorities on how that money is spent. I think one of the big issues we find in Wales, and I think it's general, I'm sure it's the case in Scotland as well, is that lack of cohesion between different agencies, so health, social care, and care services for young people. I think there's work to be done in bringing those together to get a better understanding of how those services can help people. There are simple things like housing. Making affordable, safe housing available to young people. Because remember, these. I'm fortunate. I was brought up in a normal, loving family. I have my own family now, and it's difficult to imagine, having to spend, in some cases, your entire life being cared for by strangers, and then at the end of that period, you're basically set free into society, and it's ensuring that support network exists in the longer term. And who funds that and who organises it are things that governments can help develop, but obviously you need somebody to actually provide those services, and they need to be paid for.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that the state of care and adoption in Wales has improved in recent years?
Yeah, I think generally it has across the board. I'm of the age that I remember, when I was younger, children would be in, sort of homes run by organisations like Bernardo's. And, I think there was a big stigma attached to it. I think, attitudes have changed because, the reason, children are in care, usually, they're there by no fault of their own. It's circumstances, health circumstances of parents, and multiple reasons that lead to this. So I think yes, I think things have improved. It's not an area that I have a great depth of expertise and knowledge in. But I think in general, I think society has improved, and I think that's one of my concerns about the rise of the right and the far right is that they're so regressive about everything. They want, they don't believe in sort of social justice. They don't believe in care. They've got a quite a bleak outlook on life.
So the elections are coming up in Scotland and Wales. So, for example, in Wales with the Labour government, do you think the Labour government in Wales has a chance, or do you think Reform might get in, or another party? What do you think the outcome of this election could be? It's early days, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's early days, but it's 6-7 weeks away. The polling in Wales has been quite consistent in recent months. It's seen the support for Labour has collapsed. It's now down to low double digits or even single digits. The Conservatives are seen as irrelevant. The Lib Dems have pockets of support in certain areas. And the Greens, predicted to do well in metropolitan areas, so Cardiff specifically. Reform have been doing well, but the by-election in Caerphilly that happened at the end of last year showed that Plaid Cymru can defeat them, and they did defeat them quite substantially with a 5,000 majority. So the polling suggests that Plaid Cymru are ahead of Reform, and it looks like Plaid Cymru are in a position to form a government for the first time ever. We've had 25 years of Labour here, so Wales is a bit like Scotland, but I think we're about 15 years behind. But it is interesting that when talking to people, there's a big fear of Reform. Reform have their supporters, but I think the people, their dislike of Reform is off the scale. Labour's vote has collapsed mainly due to Starmer and Labour in Westminster having, failing to deliver on any front. It's going to be quite interesting. Obviously, Plaid Cymru don't have the burden of what the SNP have as being an incumbent party. So the fact the SNP are doing so well in the polls, considering the length of time they've been in power, and it is quite interesting because obviously you get in Scotland the Labour Party in opposition, SNP bad, but when you actually look at the performance of the SNP government compared with that of Westminster and the Labour government in the Senedd in Cardiff, the SNP government has made a difference. It has improved education standards. It has reduced poverty. So, the SNP's record is something, they should be proud of. But the fact that the UK media try and portray it in a different light, again, makes clear the case that, we need better public service information and journalism in Wales, Scotland, and the whole of the UK.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so then, Paul, you are a member of the SNP and for the East Lothian area, and so do you see that the SNP has a good chance in this election, or do you think there's a bit more that needs to be done to secure a win?
No, I think Hugh's touched on it. The opinion polls have been good. I think the last one showed us on 64 seats, which is one short of a majority. They're consistently showing us above 60 seats, and I think there are going to be some key seats which will hopefully get us a majority and again push for another independence referendum. So I think one of the key things, and we've kind of talked on this all the way through, is where people in Wales and Scotland see who stands up for their interests. And consistent, when you ask people in Wales and Scotland who stands up for their interests, it'll be the SNP and Plaid Cymru are seen to do that. And that's I think is a judgment on the Labour Party and whether they stand up for either their party or they stand up for people in Scotland and Wales. And I think this is a judgment on them just now. Keir Starmer came in, promised and under-delivered. People thought there would be change. There's been no change. People are actually worse off under a Labour government and don't see Labour standing up for people in Wales and Scotland. So, hopefully Scotland will push and get an independence majority in the Parliament, an SNP majority, which will again give us the ability to have another referendum. and I'm hopeful that the Welsh Government will be a Plaid Cymru government in terms of this. And again, this is I think, a real slap in the face to Keir Starmer to say, look, they need to be doing more to support the people of Wales and Scotland. If he doesn't, they will see continued support for Plaid, continued support for the SNP, and it will push the breakup of the UK. If he doesn't do that, and from an SNP point of view, and being a member for over 30 years, the quicker the better, and the quicker we're an independent nation, and the Wales are an independent nation, the better for everybody.
And so this next question is for both of you. How do you think parties are going to address low voter turnout? Obviously that, for example, in the 2024 general election turnout was slightly higher, but especially amongst young people, voter apathy is quite high. So how are they going to address this and ensure that as many people vote as possible?
I think in Wales, I think turnout is going to be higher. I think there's going to be a buck in the trend. Caerphilly, the by-election, had a high turnout than expected, and it was a lot of that was down to younger, more engaged voters actually coming out to vote. So I'm less concerned. I think there will be more people voting. I think I think reform motivate that. I think that there's a genuine fear of reform. So I think that will drive people out to vote in order to try and stop them from a tactical point of view. And I think, again, I think people do want change, but they don't want reform as that change. So that's going to be a big motivating factor and a big driver in turnout. So I expect turnout to be higher than previous years and higher than expected.
And Paul?
I'm a really strong believer. The politics is about hope. It's about giving hope to people. It's about giving some vision to people in terms of that. I think when you see the politics of reform, for example, the politics is about politics of fear and turning communities against each other. And I think Hugh touched on that, and you've seen in Caerphilly, people thankfully came out and it was hope over fear in that particular election. I think that will be the same situation again. But we're going to have reform politicians in Wales as official opposition in both, so we can give people that hope, that vision. And I think the more politicians can do that, the more people will get coming out and voting for something rather than against something. And I think it's given people of all ages something to vote for, not something to vote against. Voting against something can be very damaging. It can be very divisive. So I think for me, it's all around about giving people that hope, that vision, and that belief in wider society. We've got to push back against reform and their politics of fear and division and pushing people against each other. That has to be defeated in Wales and Scotland and other parts of the UK as well, without a doubt. And across Europe, the far right needs to be pushed back.
Yes, I mean, John Swinney during the conference 2 weeks ago said that reform focuses on what they are against, but not what they are for. So I do agree with both of you on that sentiment of the fear of this right-wing party. So thank you both very much for your contributions and for showing up on the show. Hugh Marshall from Talking Wales and Paul McLennan from the Scottish National Party. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So, well, that is it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests Paul McLennan MSP and Hugh Marshall. Goodbye, and thank you for watching. Thank you.